Hello class, and in this video lesson we are going to talk more specifically about forces that affect motion. In this lesson we're going to look at the three words that are listed here in our standard: gravity, inertia, and friction. We have already talked about in our previous video lesson balanced and unbalanced forces. So now we're going to look at gravity, inertia, and friction and talk about how these forces affect how objects move. Let's first look at friction. Friction is a force that you have heard of before, and friction is typically a force that resists motion between two surfaces that are pressed together. So think if you have two surfaces that are pressing against each other, the more friction exists between those surfaces, the more resistance and motion that you're going to have. Friction will typically slow objects down and eventually bring them to a stop. Take a look here at some surfaces, and I want you to think about the surfaces that are shown here. Which ones are going to have more friction and which ones are going to have the least amount of friction? If you said the sandpaper, carpet, and gravel will have more friction, then you are correct. The ice, the glass, and the tile, which are very smooth surfaces, are going to tend to be the surfaces that have less friction. Therefore, it would be much easier for me to move on these surfaces at the bottom than it would for the ones at the top. And sometimes, depending on what you're doing or how you're trying to move, friction can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. It just depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to skate, or sled, like we see here, then you want to be on something like ice. You wouldn't want to be on something like carpet. So it just depends on what you're doing, will depend on, or how you're trying to move, will depend on how much friction you want to exist between those surfaces. Another factor that affects motion is gravity. Gravity is a force of attraction that exists between any two objects that have mass. The gravitational force between two objects will depend on two factors, and they are the mass of the objects and the distance between those objects. The weight of an object is the size of the gravitational force exerted on an object. So when you're talking about the weight of something, you're really talking about how much gravitational force is being exerted on that object. Let's take a little closer look at the two factors that affect gravity. Let's look at the distance first. The gravitational force between objects decreases as the distance between them increases. Let's look at a picture that will kind of help explain that to us. If you have two objects that are very close together, your gravitational force is going to be strong between those objects. However, if you have two objects that are further apart, the gravitational force is going to be much smaller or much weaker between those objects. Another factor that affects gravitational force, like we said, is the mass. The gravitational force between objects increases as the masses of the objects increase. So let's take a picture, look at a picture that will help demonstrate this even more. If you look here, the gravitational force is small between objects that have small masses. However, the gravitational force is going to be much stronger between objects that have larger masses. So as you increase the mass of an object, or the masses of two objects, the gravitational force between those objects is going to be much stronger. However, with the distance, if you have two objects and they are further apart, the further they are away from each other, the weaker the gravitational force is going to be. And then you move them closer together, the stronger it's going to be. So those are the two factors that affect the gravitational force between objects. It's going to be the mass and the distance. Inertia is our final factor that affects motion. Inertia is the tendency of an object to resist any change in motion. The tendency of a moving object to continue moving unless a force will stop it. As the mass of objects increases, the inertia will also increase. Let's take a look at some examples when we're talking about inertia. Let's first look at this picture here. One part of what we said about inertia is that an object that is in motion will continue in motion unless it's acted upon by an outside force. Well, as we can see here, as soon as this truck hits the back of this car, That ladder, which is on the top of the truck, which is in motion, it's going to continue to go, and it's going to continue in motion until it's acted on by an outside force. Well, as you can see, even when the truck hits the back of the car, the ladder is going to fly off of the top of the truck because it's following that law of inertia. Let's look at mass and inertia. Look at the images below. Which would require more force to move or slow down, and why? If you said the car, then you are correct, because it has more mass, therefore it has more inertia, which is what we said in the previous slide. The more mass an object has, the more inertia it's going to have, which means it's going to require more force in order to move or slow the object down. Let's take a look at another one. Which would require more force to move or slow down, and why? You have a bowling ball and a tennis ball. If you said the bowling ball, then you are correct. The bowling ball is going to have or require more force to move or slow down because it has more mass, therefore it's going to have more inertia. And that is the end of our video lesson on motion and factors that affect motion. Make sure you go back and you have adequate notes in your foldable, and you have also drawn some really good pictures to represent some of the concepts that were discussed in this video lesson.